Welcome to the Beautiful Game Plan podcast, produced by Focus Shift Films and sponsored by Welsh sports fans. I'm your host, Daniel J. Harris. I'm a filmmaker and entrepreneur working across sport, and I'm a huge fan of sports content. This podcast is my chance to meet amazing people who are doing amazing things in the sports content space and to share their stories with you in the hope that it inspires ideas. So on this episode, we have the amazing Andy Marston, who is the founder of Sports Pundit. Andy, welcome to the Beautiful Game Plan podcast. You've held a number of positions or roles across sports and tech industries. Can you give us a brief history of your career in sports so far?
Yeah, first off, thanks so much for having me on the pod. Really appreciate the invite. I'm usually sat the other side of the microphone, I guess, because I also do a podcast for Sports Pundit. As we were just sort of talking through, my career started at an agency called CSM, which is now part of Wasserman. I started there as an insights and research exec and then manager. And then while I was in that role, I was obviously consuming a lot of content and a lot of news. But my role was very internally focused. So seeing how much of the sports industry is sort of built on personal relationships, I wanted to come up with a way to start sort of expanding my network. The most introverted way, I guess, to do that was to start a newsletter, because it meant not having to walk into rooms and go and just randomly talk to strangers. So it tied in, I guess, with the skills I already had around research and allowed me to start to sort of build some confidence and start to build a few relationships. And then I would say everything that's happened in my career post that has probably been a result of that network that I've built with Sports Pundit. So the newsletter itself has been going for 4 years, and then relationships within that. A guy called Roger Mitchell was quite early to start reading the content, and he's a prolific sports tech investor and a extremely esteemed kind of executive in his own right that was previously at the Scottish Premier League. He liked the content. He initially reached out to me to see if I could help with some of the comms work at a company he was invested in called Zone 7. And the relationship sort of built from there. He also introduced me later on to a company called Entourage, where I ended up becoming chief of staff. So worked agency side, then across to sports tech with Zone 7 and Entourage. And then also got to know Rory and Fergus Bell through the newsletter initially, and they are the guys that set up the Players Fund, which is a athlete-backed venture fund, which is where I now work as a value creation partner. So the newsletter is the common thread, I guess, or the network and the community that the newsletter has enabled is the common thread, and it's something that I will continue to build alongside, because I think the more people you know and understand their motivations, what's interesting to them, like the more opportunity that opens up in everything else.
Fantastic. And you said you founded Sports Pundit in 2020. Just tell us, what exactly is it? If people come along to Sports Pundit, what do they find there? And how has it evolved since those early days through to now?
Yeah, I guess the initial inspiration when I started it was outside of sport. So there's a guy called Sam Parr who started something called The Hustle in the US, which was sort of like a sports tech. Oh no, sorry, not sports tech, but a technology focused newsletter, but written in a way that would maybe be more accessible than like traditional news. Morning Brew would probably be another example of a newsletter that's in a similar kind of ilk, written kind of email first rather than longer media copy that's been translated onto an email. And so I really liked what he'd done with The Hustle. I think around that time it got acquired by HubSpot for a fairly significant amount of money. And I thought, well, what if I could create kind of like The Hustle, but for sports news? Because it felt like there wasn't really anyone focusing on the newsletter angle at that point. Obviously, newsletters have since exploded because of things like Substack. So it feels like everyone's now got a newsletter. But I guess the evolution of Sports Pundit has been it not just being content anymore, So you've got the newsletters which go out on Tuesdays and Fridays, but you've also got a WhatsApp group, a podcast, physical events in London and New York that are monthly. And that's all kind of inspired by just kind of wanting to get to know the people that are reading it more and more.
Nice. Yeah, I think with this podcast as well, working in sport for the last couple of years and meeting amazing people and seeing so many amazing stories, I kind of saw there was a little bit of a gap in the market in the sports world for creating content around sports content and fan engagement and sharing some of their stories. And it sounds like you realized there was a bit of a gap in the market there as well for that communication between different professionals working in sport, different sports clubs, and the sharing of some of that best practice and some of the great activity that was going on. Tell us a little bit about some of those the first kind of bits of content that you put out there. How did you know that it was working? When did you realize that you really had something that was going to grow, and what were the next steps for that?
Yeah, I would say initially I was obviously starting with very little audience, so I actually piggybacked quite heavily off other content that already existed. So referred to Roger Mitchell already, but he had a podcast called Are You Not Entertained? Still has a podcast called Are You Not Entertained? And it's a entertaining podcast. It talks about a lot of sort of trends across the sports industry, but there was no written up version. And then not everyone has an hour to listen to a podcast. So I quite liked the idea of like, oh, maybe I could focus on stuff that's been discussed within that podcast. And it almost becomes kind of like additional piece of content that sits alongside the podcast, which meant from fairly early on, I was able to kind of piggyback, I guess, off of his already developed audience. So that would be one element, I guess, of how it grew in the early days. I think I was also able to provide a take on things from the perspective of someone that was maybe a bit younger in the industry, because generally speaking, the people commenting on things across the sports industry are in more senior roles, because that's when you, I guess, develop more confidence or need to speak more publicly about what's going on. And so I guess there was a nice gap in the market for someone to say like, oh, here's the perspective of a 23-year-old that's working in sport. And actually, because there weren't that many other 23-year-olds trying to give their opinion, it allowed you to have a bit more cut through, I guess. And I still kind of think I'm a bit older than that now, but I still kind of like the idea that I can be kind of a bridge between maybe the older executives, because there's a lot of older executives that are still really eager to learn and keep up to date with what's going on. And also the younger executives, and kind of like facilitate up and down kind of, I think, mentor-mentee type relationships that go both ways are really valuable. So if I can amplify someone that's 21, 22 that's doing amazing things or has a really unique perspective, then I want to do that as much as I want to amplify someone that's in their 50s or 60s or 70s that's been working in sport for 30 years, and what they have to say is also valid and interesting. But I think trying to be someone that can kind of aggregate both sides of the market and say like, let's look at the perspectives of various different age groups. I quite like being that.
Yeah, it sounds like there was already a kind of audience there, and what you've done is you've added value to that audience by providing the written side to the podcast that was already there from Roger Mitchell, and then you've also realised that this could be translated for other audiences in terms of younger sports content creators, and so you've been able to kind of build upon that platform and add more value to those already engaged, but also find a new audience to come and find some of that stuff. Sounds like you've really found a great way to connect those things.
Yeah, so I would say what I didn't want to do was just be a news aggregator, because ultimately, like, there's already enough news channels out there, right? Like, I'm not going to compete with a Sports Pro or a Sport Business. They have amazing journalists that are going to be able to cover all of the top stuff, and they're being sent all the press releases and all of the updates as soon as they come, right? So I'm not going to break news, but what I felt like I could do was say like, okay, here's 3 articles that have come out in the last week, and here's the common thread between them, right? So it was kind of like trying to add that additional point on top of what was being announced. It was like, here's an announcement, here's an announcement, and here's an announcement. And if you're looking at them in singularity, they're kind of interesting, but not that interesting. But actually, if you look at all 3 of them together, there's actually quite an interesting pattern across the 3 of them for whatever reason, right? So it was kind of like aggregation plus added value, or it was how can I amplify something that's already been said and is interesting to a different audience that maybe wouldn't have yet read it. And so I would say they're probably like the two areas of focus. And then also it started with Roger's podcast, but now the Friday highlight reel will be kind of a roundup of lots and lots of different people's kind of opinions and thoughts. And it's then my kind of interpretation of what I've come across that week that I thought was interesting, that hopefully other people also then enjoy or find value in as well.
Yeah, and it sounds like that background in analytics is useful there as well, because you've got a very analytical mind, and rather than reading just one story in singularity, as you said, you're looking at three different stories, and we're analyzing the three of them, seeing where those common threads are, and then drawing your own information, your own added value from that to create your own piece of valuable content that's drawing from other people's valuable content. So there's a great pipeline there for you to translate in your language to your audience from something that's already established.
Yeah, for sure. That's essentially the crux of it, right? And I think that's where a lot of the value is, because if you think about people that work in any industry, but sport particularly, they're very busy. There's a ton of content. So if you're going to get read, then you need to be offering something that's insightful, but also respectful of the time that someone has available. And so like, I guess that's why having the parameter of having to try and fit it into a newsletter is quite helpful, because if you're writing on a blog or you have no time bound kind of publishing schedule, then it's easy to just publish stuff on it every time a piece of content comes through. Whereas actually, if you know every Friday you're only going to highlight 2 opinion pieces and you're only going to highlight the 5 most interesting stories of the week, then you kind of have to do that cull of like, here's what's actually important. And then the skill of that, I guess, kind of comes over time, but also comes from just having a really clear idea of like who you want to be reading it. So I think that's the other part that's important here, is like, there's the content you create if you want the most possible viewers or readers, and there's the content you create if you want the most valuable readers, and they're different. Like, so I think that quality quantity piece is probably like the next stage of that, is like being really true to, okay, I want to provide value to someone that works as a head of digital at a top tier rights holder, or I want to be appealing to someone that's a CMO or a CTO at a top sports league, right? Like, but then staying true to that and saying like, if it wouldn't be something that they are going to want to read, then I'm not going to talk about it. I'm not going to publish it.
Yeah, and I think this kind of links quite nicely to a conversation that I was having with Joe Towns. So Joe Towns is the course leader at Cardiff Met Sports Broadcast course, and he's worked at the BBC's worked at Sky over the years, and we were talking about how sport is a massive industry and there's a huge audience, but within that there's kind of niches and small audiences. So, and that there's an opportunity for young people to find their niche within that. So you found your niche within taking information, distilling it down, and providing kind of shorter, more concise versions of it with additional value to people who are busy and short on time. And you found your niche within that. Like, I know myself, I found my niche within Welsh football. So I was working with the Welsh FA, and we were creating content for the fans themselves. So we were taking what was happening in Welsh football, and we were looking at that through the eyes of the average Welsh fan. And we found our little niche audience there that we engaged with through short form video on social media. So it's interesting to see how you found your niche that fitted with your background in terms of analytics and in terms of news, and then delivering it to those busy CTOs, CMOs at that high level. Yeah, it just goes to show there's so many different opportunities within sport if you can find your little niche and you can carve out an opportunity for yourself.
Yeah, for sure. And I think the key thing there is just like being true to what you're generally interested in. So like, if you tell someone to go after a niche, that's great, but it needs to be a niche where they also have some sort of enthusiasm or interest, maybe like slightly above the norm. It doesn't mean they have to go after the thing that they're most interested in the whole world, but like, it helps if you're talking about Welsh football, that you really care about Welsh football, right? And that's going to be like a differentiator because that will come across in the content. And I think if you want to sustain it over a really long period of time, then you need to be genuinely interested and want to learn about that subject and want to talk about that subject. Because if you pick something which you're like, oh, this would be a really good niche because there's a really nice addressable market here, but I actually couldn't care less about it, then I think you'll only get so far before you kind of give up. And I think people will also read into the fact that you're not generally interested. Like, there's no point creating a community of people that you don't actually want to hang out with, right? So I guess that's the second part.
Yeah, exactly. It's authenticity, isn't it? Do you mean it's kind of people can tell if you're not genuine about your passion for something, or you're not really, your heart really isn't in it. You got no skin in the game. So making sure that it is something that you believe in, I think that comes across in the content you make then.
Yeah, for sure.
Fantastic. So where's Sports Pundit at the moment, and what do you envision the future being? What sort of what things have you got in the pipeline, and where would you like it to go? Where would the end game for Sports Pundit be?
Yeah, so I'm not entirely sure on the end game, right? Because I think when I initially started it, my goal at the time was build my network, and I kind of thought my wildest objective at that point was like maybe I get a few brand managers subscribe, and that helps land a sponsorship deal at the agency I'm currently at, right? Like it's very hard to see what the opportunity is beyond that at that point in time. And then obviously what happened was a lot more interesting than that, because I met a sports investor and then ended up working for a sports technology business. And then I was working for a sports technology business and met someone that was starting a venture fund backed by people like Ben Stokes and Jess Ennis. And they're like, hey, would you want to come and be part of our fund? So I wouldn't want to put a cap on exactly where the opportunity finishes, because it's already kind of exceeded what my objective would have been initially. So I think that it's important to have a direction of travel, but not necessarily to know exactly what the end point looks like. I guess as a broad objective, it's just continue to provide value to people I find interesting and want to work alongside. In terms of what's on the roadmap, I think it's quite cliche to say, but I guess the transition I'm trying to make is away from content and more towards community. So content still plays a really important role in that as a flywheel to engage the community on a consistent basis. But I think if you start to think about the product being the amazing people that sit within the community, then you address things in a slightly different way. And so yeah, I would say the main goals are all focused on trying to better serve the community of people that exist within the Sports Pundit ecosystem currently, and then the ones that will in the future. So the way I'm thinking about that is kind of like trying to create tiers. So at the moment, everything has been on just a singular tier, right? I create a newsletter and a podcast, and it goes out distributed to everyone. And in terms of engagement, I get a overline figure of like this many people read the newsletter. Substack tells you open rates and a few other things, but not tons of information. And you have email addresses, but you don't necessarily know where someone works or who they are or what they're interested in. And then on the podcast side, you have even less data. You've got like, I don't know, an overall number of people that listened, and maybe some kind of breakdown geographically that a certain amount of them are in the UK and some of them are in the US. But it was very hard for me to know like who's listened in terms of like, is it the CTO of Tottenham Hotspur that's listening, or is it like a fan of football team that has no actual direct link into the sports industry but's just curious? Like because obviously one's got more inherent value within what I'm trying to build than the other, so it's important to kind of know that. So I guess the steps I'm trying to take are, how do you build kind of like a next tier to the engagement, which has started through the WhatsApp group and the networking drinks, but I want to try and create like a more clear distinction between like the people that sit kind of in that first layer, which is just consuming content without really giving me much information back, and then like the second tier of people, which is like the people that are engaging in the WhatsApp group and the people that are coming along to the events in London, which are just free events. And I want to keep them free because like I said, I like being able to meet both ends of the industry, right? And if you price people out, then you're not going to get the young people coming along, and you're not going to get the senior people that maybe work for themselves as consultants, because generally speaking, the people that attend the major conferences are the ones that have company cards, right? So the goal would be to build out kind of like a clearer kind of like membership, I guess. Not necessarily, that doesn't necessarily mean that they have to have paid to be part of it. It just means that there's some kind of like obstacle they have to overcome in order to go from casual consumer to member and committed to the community kind of thing. And I don't know exactly how that looks yet, but that would be kind of like where I'm trying to get to, I guess, would be building out that kind of like membership tier to the kind of like, yeah, to what Sports Pundit is. And then on top of that, you can then, I guess, better serve certain people within it. So whether that's like you then create like small bespoke invite only events where you kind of like pick out key people around certain topics, whether that's like investing or like media or digital, like you can start to kind of try to serve certain segments of that community in kind of like more specific ways, or like to go to your point of around like creating niches. I think you can start to sort of segment by niches within that community.
Sponsored by Welsh sports fans and their award-winning Riverside Sports Bar, an American-style sports bar with a distinctly Welsh feel. Great food, great atmosphere, and all the sport, as well as a range of Welsh products at Wales' #1 sports bar.
Yeah, and it sounds like you've got a clear idea of why you do it, and what you do and how you do it is quite flexible, quite agile. Let's see what happens. Let's see how that evolves. Let's see what people are doing, what they want, how they want it, and that Sports Pundit kind of product and offering evolves then over time, depending on where the kind of customer takes you, I suppose. But that clear why of adding value to them runs through everything you do, and then the kind of roadmap evolves according to what best serves that why. Would that be a correct kind of thing to say?
Yeah, pretty much. I would say that, yeah, it's all about adding value and creating bridges and lines of communication between people that maybe otherwise wouldn't connect. So what I really like, the feedback I like the most from the physical events is when someone says, hey, I came along to your event and I met a load of people I've never met before. And usually when I go to an event, I just see the same people, right? That means I'm doing something right, because I'm able to bring together people that don't usually get the chance to meet. And that's the key objective, really, because what's the point in doing it if I'm just bringing together the same people that are also meeting at whatever event it might be, right? I want my event to be the one that's connecting them with people that they don't usually come across.
And is there a lot of cross-pollination between sports? Like the sport is a huge kind of arena, but I tend to find that some of the different sports are kind of quite siloed. Football separate from rugby, separate from cricket, and there doesn't tend to be that much kind of cross-pollination and crossover between the people. They kind of like, we're football, you're rugby, you're hockey, and we all do our separate things. But actually, there's so many different challenges that they would share. There's so many different solutions to those challenges that they could share. And there could be a lot more sharing of information between sports and looking at it from different perspectives from different sports that could help find solutions. Are you finding that you're getting a cross-pollination and different types of sports coming together, or are you finding you've got more of one and less of another?
I would say, generally speaking, there is a broad range of sports represented. I think being UK based, you're always going to end up with more football than anything else, just because that's where a lot of the business is. But I think you get a lot of people in the groups that have maybe worked agency side. And if you've worked agency side, then you're maybe representing a football club one day and then an F1 team. And then you might also work on a rugby project or a track and field or whatever it is. So I think there is quite a broad range of people across different sports. I don't think it's isolated. And I think you are getting people that are kind of saying, oh, hey, this is how it worked out for us in football. Maybe this could be interesting to you. Or this is how it worked out for us when we were doing whatever in rugby league. Maybe that would be useful for you. But I don't know, field hockey, right? Like, so there are definitely people in there that are across a range of different sports. And I agree completely that there is a ton of value to be exchanged between all of them, because a lot of them are going through the same problems, right? Like they have very similar business models and they're all trying to pivot in quite similar ways. Some of them obviously have bigger cost centers currently that they need to try to maintain while pivoting than others. So for some of the smaller sports, it might actually be a little bit easier for them to switch the model if they don't have huge media rights coming in already. Whereas if you're reliant on media rights, it becomes a little bit more difficult to suddenly just switch your whole business model around overnight, even if you can see the kind of logic behind the shift. But no, I think the bit that I would like to try and extend upon even further is actually what you can learn from outside of sports. I'm not quite sure how to do that yet, because I think if you just let a load of people into the group that aren't working in sport, you risk kind of diluting it too much. But maybe there's like special content series that could be created in future where it's like bringing someone in that's worked in aviation on a flight rewards program and like air miles, and they can talk about that. Or maybe it's someone from like a supermarket talking about something similar, right, around like the kind of like loyalty cards, because I think they're two industries that have done that really well, and actually sport should be able to do something in that kind of like rewards loyalty program space very easily, because you've actually got built-in loyalty rather than like conceived fake loyalty, which is what they're having to work with. So I think that's an area. I think there's a ton of different pieces. There's a lady coming to the event I'm hosting in November who's a professional rugby player for Saracens, but she also works for Jaguar Land Rover in the AI division. And I'm like, okay, well, that's really cool. Like, what is being utilized? How is AI being utilized within car manufacturing? And like, is there any crossover there from an organizational processes perspective to the sports industry, right? So like, it would help everyone, I think, for people that work in sport to look outside of sport a little bit more often, I think. So I definitely want to find a way to try and help people to do that, because again, it comes back to people just being so busy that they don't have time and they don't know where to look. And unless you take the time to curate the insights that are outside sport, I don't think there's that many people that have the time to go away and say, like, I'm going to spend a week researching the aviation industry to see what I could bring into sports. But there's probably a ton to be learned there. Same with like FMCG brands and stuff like that, who are very good at sort of like direct to consumer marketing and things like that. So when you do get people that have been hired in from outside sports, you'll often see they'll be the ones that really create change. So yeah, that would be one area that I think could be developed more.
Yeah, people come in with a different perspective and hadn't thought about how the airlines and how the supermarkets have created kind of brand loyalty. And you've got so much brand loyalty in sport. If you support a football club, if you were to buy health insurance and there was standard health insurance, or there was standard health insurance linked to your football club, you're more likely to buy the one linked to the football club because you feel that brand loyalty. So I'm always surprised that more brands don't use sport to create loyalty for their brand outside of sport, if you know what I mean. So like, again, like say a health insurance company. So if you get the Cardiff City health insurance, then you get a percentage off something at Cardiff City, or there's some link to the club there. So I think a lot of brands could be tapping into that brand loyalty within sport to help sell their products. But I hadn't been thinking about how sport could learn from brands outside of sport on creating some of that loyalty and creating some of those schemes that encourage that loyalty. So that's something I'll certainly be thinking about moving forward, I think.
Yeah, and on the brand loyalty thing, I got introduced by a guy called Michael Sutherland, who's in the WhatsApp group. He's the former CTO at Real Madrid. And Yeah, he reached out to me because he came across a platform called Calda, who basically do rewards programs. Not necessarily in sport, but they've done one with Benfica where that was essentially what happened, right? They brought Repsol in as a kind of like cashback partner. So anyone that supported Benfica could attach their cards to this Benfica rewards program, and if they bought petrol at Repsol, it would give them a small amount of cash into their sort of like wallet to spend with Benfica. And it drove like a ton of loyalty towards a petrol station, right? So it's not necessarily asking fans to spend more money. It's just saying like when you fill up your car, you're going to now drive past the Shell garage and go to the Repsol one, because that way you're going to get a couple quid off of your next time you're in the Benfica club shop or you're buying a ticket to a game. So I think that's really smart. And I think more clubs will probably start to do things like that. Maybe not necessarily with that company, but I'm sure there are other ones available. But the idea of a cashback rewards program, I think, is quite smart.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm always surprised that more clubs aren't doing more things like that, because sometimes I think people get caught up with their football fans, they like football. But football fans drive cars, eat food, go on holiday, buy clothes, do a number of other things. So if you can get them to choose to go to Tesco instead of Sainsbury's, to choose Repsol over Shell, to get their health insurance with this company rather than that company, their car insurance with that company instead of that company, then these brands can use that sport loyalty in order to help that large fan base choose one company over a number of other companies because it's linked to their club. And then that means that they can get cash back, the club gets some sort of benefit, and then that brand gets some sort of benefit as well because they've tapped into that fan base. And I'm always surprised that more clubs aren't doing those sort of loyalty schemes to direct their fans towards buying one product over another.
Yeah, I think there's definitely an element of kind of loyalty that rights holders can tap into, which isn't necessarily asking fans to spend more, which I think is what's nice about it. And because I think a lot of the time when we talk about like monetizing fans, it's this like horrible thing where you've got into sport because you really are passionate about it. And then you end up on the commercial side of sport, and your job is basically just like, how do you squeeze more and more money out of someone's wallet, right? Which I get it, like the world is a commercial place, but like that's not necessarily like what's driving you. Is like, oh, I'd love to get an extra fiver out of everyone in the stadium, right? Like, whereas if you can say, well, they're already spending money on clothes or money on shopping or money on petrol or money on their heating, but we can just influence that they spend it with them instead of them, then I think it's a nice way to tap into something that's happening regardless, but you're just leveraging the loyalty you already have. But yeah, I have been introduced to them, and I am introducing them to a few people I know in sports, but I have no direct affiliation yet with them. But maybe in the future, maybe if they hear this podcast, that will change. Maybe they'll get you signed up as well.
Maybe. But yeah, like I spoke to Harry Harris, the journalist, about the cost of football shirts. And it's like you just talked about, it's like, how can we make more money? Right, well, let's put our football shirts from 50 quid to 60 quid to 70 quid to 80 quid. Now, people's wages and expendable cash is not rising at the same rate. So if everything in football or hockey or netball or rugby or whatever becomes more and more expensive, then people can afford to do less and less and less. Whereas if you're saying you're spending 50 quid at Tesco, why don't you spend it at Asda? You're spending 50 quid at Shell, why don't you spend it at Repsol? Then you're not asking them to spend more money. You're asking them to spend that same money slightly differently, which can benefit them and benefit the club. And you can use that loyalty to build that ecosystem where it's win-win for fan and club, rather than, right, let's get them to spend more. Let's put the price of a pie up. Let's put the price of a pint up. Let's put the price of a ticket up. Let's put the price of a shirt up. And the average fan is sat there going, man, this is becoming extremely expensive to do the thing I love, that I'm passionate about. And then you get a little bit of audience fatigue then, with them going, oh, man, how much? How much to go to the game? How much to buy a shirt? They start to lose a little bit of love because it's all money, 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 commercial, commercial, commercial. And there doesn't seem to be a lot coming back the other way, because it's still the same 90 minutes on the pitch. It's still a shirt. So how can you add value to them without saying you're going to spend more? So I think it sounds like they're the sort of conversations that you're having with people, that I'm having with people. So maybe there's an opportunity for us to chat a bit more off the podcast about what that could look like.
Yeah, I think for sure that's why when I got introduced, I was intrigued and wanted to have a conversation. I think also for sports outside of football, it's interesting. So I advise a group called Super Tri, which is a short form triathlon racing series. And they have an elite series, and then they have a grassroots participation element. But I mean, it's interesting almost more so for someone like that, and they're not affiliated at this point with Calder in any way. But where I think it becomes interesting there is you've got a really wealthy audience that are spending a ton of gear, a ton of cash on triathlon gear, right? Like they're buying expensive bikes, they're buying triathlon suits, they're probably traveling in order to get to the venue where the triathlon is taking place. And you're not yet tapping into really any of those expenditures that your fan is going through in order to be even participating in your sport. So it feels like a really big opportunity for a sport like that, or a sport like golf, for example, where you're buying the clubs and you're spending money on travel and even green fees and things like that. Like, is there a way for athletes or organizations to somehow influence where you're going to play and what brand you're using when you buy your clubs or things like that? So I think it goes much broader. And then I think also on women's sport, it's interesting as well, because you haven't got the same commercial models in the first place, but you've got a huge amount of spending power on the women's side, right? Like I think the statistics, something like 80% of household expenditure comes from the women in the household, right? So if you're a brand that wants to tap into household spending, then should you be looking at sports that maybe attract more female fans, right? Which might be women's sport, or it might be a sport like F1 that manages to attract a lot of women, or is it just about like sports that are maybe male in participation, but they have a female fan strategy and they're able to tap more into that kind of like female consumer markets? I think it goes to all of those things. Like there's so many ways you could take that.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting point. And traditionally, sport has been very male orientated, but the fact that a large amount of the household spend is managed by women, then there definitely is an opportunity to engage with them and help that household to make choices linked to a sports club or a membership scheme or whatever that is. So yeah, I think that's a very interesting point.
Yeah, I think on the women's sports stuff, it's all really exciting that it's growing so fast. But one mistake I think I see fairly regularly is just the amount of people that assume that investing in women's sports means you're capturing female attention. And I think that they're two potentially linked but different parts of the same strategy. Like one part of it is like we really need to improve female participation in sport and the professional side of female participation in sport. But we also need to think about how do we position sport in a different way that's going to actually attract more women to want to participate and watch and become engaged. Because ultimately, if all you do is change the gender of the players on the pitch and nothing else changes, why would someone suddenly become interested? Like, I like to use the example, I don't personally follow volleyball, right? Volleyball's predominantly a female sport, at least in the US it is. If I don't watch women's volleyball, if you suddenly change the players to men, it doesn't mean I suddenly like volleyball, right? Like, I wasn't interested in volleyball when it was women playing. I'm not interested now as men playing. So the same kind of applies in football. People think like, oh, well, if we have a women's team, then suddenly all the women are going to be interested. And actually, okay, yeah, some women are interested. But there's a load of women that weren't interested in football, men's or women's. And just because the gender of the participants has changed, doesn't mean they suddenly care. So I just think we need to think about like, what else can we be doing to engage female fandom, or to even just ignite female fandom? And I think at the grassroots level, like with really young girls coming through now, that will be different because they've grown up seeing the Lionesses and like worshipping them, and like you hear stories, like anecdotal stories of people that have kids that are maybe under 10 or 11 or 12, and when they play, you know, EAFC, they'll play with men's players and women's players, and when you ask them who their favorite player is, they'll say, oh, men, or like men's team or women's team, right? Because they've grown up with it, and like the visibility's been there. But I think there's more to be done on the kind of like, if you're going to convert kind of women that are currently like 18 to 30, 35, then a different strategy is maybe needed.
Yeah, I think there needs to be a deeper level of understanding that women are different to men. It's saying simple, but there's a certain kind of ignorance or arrogance in sports sometimes, and there's a phrase that Maggie Murphy, formerly of Lewis FC, said to me once: "Pink it and shrink it." You go, "Oh, we want it to work for women. Let's just make it pink and slightly smaller, and that'll attract women." Rather than saying, "Okay, what are women looking for? What do they want from sport? What do they want from sport clothing? What do they want from sports events?" They're a different audience with different needs, with different passions, with different requirements. So how do we make a product for them instead of just going, "Oh, well, that's men's football. Pink it and shrink it and make women's football." And the great example you made, there's women's volleyball. Let's put men in it, and now men will like volleyball. That's too simplistic a view, isn't it? And it doesn't work. You have to think about who are the audience, what do they want, and how can I give them what they want in a way that surprises them, and that then engages them. That's the kind of magic formula, rather than, oh, well, let's just swap what men for women and women for men, and there we go, simple. We've created a new industry. It doesn't work that way, does it?
Yeah, and I think to bring it back to Sports Pundit, like one of the objectives I've got when I think about content and I think about the events I'm putting on is like, how do I engage female executives as much as I engage male executives? And obviously that's difficult to do because the numbers don't completely align, right? There's a lot more men working in sport than women, but I'll always try my best to make sure I'm amplifying the voice of women that work in sport, whether that be they work in women's sport or they work in men's sport, or they work for an agency, or they even work outside of sport. I think it's important that you're getting perspectives from as wide a range of experience as possible. And so, yeah, for the event I'm doing in November, which is my first kind of like bigger event, which is called Speakers Only, there's 50 people, invite only. Half the room is male, half the room is female, and half the room is under 30 as well. So it kind of speaks to that, right? You've got 10 panels over 2 days. So if there's 50 people, then you've got 5 per panel, right? So you've got 10 hosts, and then you've got 2 on each panel that are under 30 and 2 that are over 30. And they're like mentors and mentees, because no one wants to be called the over 30s, right? So that's kind of like a new format that I'm trialing, and maybe will be very close to happening, I guess, when this goes out. But it all comes back to, I remember saying to someone I wanted it to be half and half, and they're like, "Oh, well, don't sweat it if it's like only a little bit off." And I'm like, "No, I really want it to be half and half, because the population of the UK is 50-50. And if you want the room to be representative of the audience it serves, then you need it to be equal, right? Like, what's the point in kind of like half-assing it and saying like, "Oh yeah, well, we could have like 20 and then 30 on that side"? Like, no, I want it to be, I get that there'll be more men, I guess, missing out because there's more men working in sport, but I think it's important that you're providing a voice. And I also think that will then encourage more women to want to speak at events and want to be part of something. I think you have to build it up. You have to give them the platform on like a level playing field platform as well. Like, there's no panel. It's not like I've filled it because there's a whole section that's just going to be like why women should be in sport kind of thing. There is one discussion which will be around female fan strategy, but not necessarily, which is kind of to that point we brought up earlier. Like, women's sport isn't the only part to that. Like, there's more to it than that. And actually, interestingly, when I did the application process for the academy, for the under 30s, I made it open application. So you would apply by saying which panel you wanted to discuss and why, and like what you'd talk about if you were selected for that panel. And both male and female, the most selected panel was like, why is it important to have a female fan strategy? Both men and women, I had the most applicants asking me, I want to be on that panel, which I thought was really interesting.
Very, very interesting. And you're absolutely right. You can't pay lip service to it. You can't do something for the sake of doing something. If you want to make a difference, you want to be representative, you've got to work a little bit harder sometimes, haven't you? And you've got to try and make sure that those numbers are equal, that things add up, that things are done in the right way and provide the right opportunity, rather than a kind of pink it and shrink it mentality, which is just paying lip service to it. So, Andy, I want to thank you very much for chatting today. I think it's been absolutely brilliant. There's some really interesting conversations in here, and I think we could talk for hours and hours on this, but we've got to wrap it up. So thank you very much for your time. Just before you go, do you want to let people know where they can find out more about you and about Sports Pundit?
Yeah, sure. So the Sports Pundit website is just sportspundit.co, and you can find me on LinkedIn, Andy Marston. I'm not really too active on other platforms, so it's probably best to go LinkedIn. And happy to connect.
Fantastic. So thank you very much for your time. I hope that the event in November is a massive success, and I'd love to hear more about it after that. And thank you to those at home that are watching or listening. Make sure you tune in for more episodes and subscribe to stay up to date with all the new episodes. Thank you very much. Don't forget to like and share this episode and subscribe to the channel for more content.